right, it is 10 o'clock in the US, 4 o'clock in Europe. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Marcus Walter. I'm the Director of Greenhouse Gas Accounting and Standards at CBA. A quick word about CBA. We're the Clean Energy Buyers Association. We're a trade association for energy customers and partners. We advocate for market and policy solutions for clean energy by engaging regulators and standard setters in the US and globally. We are very excited to co-host this webinar today with Resource. We have the honor of having Annie on the phone with us here too. Resource is an alliance of stakeholders representing clean energy buyers and suppliers in Europe. Before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be available later on YouTube. We'll share the link with you. Second, feel free to submit any questions via the Q&A functions in Zoom. We will cover those questions, at least as many as we can, at the 20-minute Q&A section at the end. And lastly, a quick antitrust reminder. Please don't discuss any non-public competitive sensitive information with any competitors here, just so we can stay all out of trouble. With that, let's talk about the agenda and why we're here. So 2024 has been a big year for elections, both in the US and in Europe. We'll take a look how clean energy markets will be impacted on both sides of the Atlantic. We're also just a few weeks away from 2025, which is the last year of the transitional phase of the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. We'll talk about what CBAM means and how PPAs factor into this. With that, let me quickly introduce our panel that we have today. On CBA's side, we have Kyle Davis, who's the Senior Director of Federal Affairs. He will talk about the US federal and election policy update. We have Annie Scanlan from Resource, who will introduce herself in a second. We have from DLA Piper, we have Andreas and Kenneth, two experts in energy and transactional law for the EU. And last but not least, we have Brett Smith, who's the Senior Director of Government Relations at the American Iron and Steel Institute. Really excited to hear from all of you. Let me hand it over to Annie.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It's really a pleasure to be collaborating with CBAM on this webinar. So yes, I'm director of the Resource platform. Resource brings together corporate renewable energy buyers and renewable energy suppliers, really with the mission of how can we help more corporates in Europe to procure renewables and in their pursuit of heading to net zero, which is the big goal in Europe. So we're somewhat the kind of EU version of CBA, but it's great to be teaming up with CBA on this with our other speakers as well, because there's really significant interest in how things are developing on the US and EU side and how this will impact corporate energy buyers. So it's really great to kind of pool this expertise and work together. And I'm really looking forward to the presentations and discussions today. And I'm going to hand over now directly to Kyle, who's going to tell us what's happening in the US.
First of all, thank you for inviting me today. As Marcus said, I'm Kyle Davis. I'm a Senior Director of Federal Affairs over at CBA. So my job is sort of to track what's been going on with the US elections and help our management team and our members translate what that might mean for clean energy in the United States. So what I'm going to do today, just very briefly, is give you an overview of the recent election results and then touch on a little bit about what we expect the federal policy focus to be during the next 4 years during the Trump administration. So President Donald Trump won the White House, controlled the White House with a little over 50% of the popular vote. What it translated into, as far as how we elect presidents in the United States, he was able to capture what we call 312 electoral votes to Kamala Harris's 226 electoral votes. And ultimately, the presidential candidate just needs 270 electoral votes to win. So what we'll do is, rather than elect a president by popular vote, it is a formulaic approach where each individual state has a certain number of electoral votes. So Donald Trump prevailed. So we're going to have Donald Trump 2.0 for the next 4 years in the United States. At the same time, Republicans were able to win control of the U.S. Senate. Currently, the U.S. Senate is controlled by Democrats, but that changes beginning in January of next year. Republicans have a very narrow margin of control in the U.S. Senate. They were able to capture 53 of the 100 Senate seats. So the split is going to be 53 Republicans to 47 Democrats. And if we ever have a tie, a 50-50 split on a particular vote in the U.S. Senate, the incoming vice president is the tiebreaker. So again, Republicans will control the U.S. Senate with a vote margin 53 to 47. Republicans were surprisingly also able to capture control of the House of Representatives. That had not been a popular perspective. We knew it was a possibility, but Democrats had really high hopes that they would have been able to recapture control of the House of Representatives. Currently, this current congressional cycle, the Democrats are the minority, and House Republicans thus were able to maintain control. But the House Republicans lost a number of seats, and their control margin is super, super narrow. So ultimately, Republicans have 220 seats in the House of Representatives to the Democrats' 215. That's actually going to get even smaller here in the next few months because a number of congressional Republicans, House members that were reelected, were actually selected by the incoming Trump administration to serve in that administration. So they'll be leaving their seats, and we'll have some special elections later in 2025. So at least for the first couple months of the incoming Trump administration, we expect the margin of control to be 217 Republicans to 215 Democrats. That's going to be really, really narrow. And at least for legislating in the United States, when you have a brand new president, he usually tries to accomplish his big marquee legislative wins during the first 100 days of his term, and especially when his party has won the trifecta like they have here. But that's going to be really, really tough if Republicans only have that two-seat margin of control in the House of Representatives. That means one Republican can mess up all the planning that they have in place to try and move the incoming president's agenda very aggressively. The other thing that I want to mention too, trifectas, where you have a complete control of Washington, D.C. by one particular party, is pretty rare in the United States. It usually only lasts for 2 years. So a lot of folks are expecting that when we have our midterm elections in 2026, that's typically when the party that has a trifecta loses at least one of the congressional chambers. You know, they'll keep the White House. And what a lot of folks are forecasting is that the Senate in 2026, meaning going into the 2027 calendar year, could flip to Democratic control. So that's something to keep in mind. It may be very much what we saw during the first Trump administration and prior to that during the Obama administration, where they had complete party control for the first 2 years of the president's administration and then split party control for the last 2 years of the administration. So that's a quick and dirty overview of the election results. What's going on right now is the incoming Trump administration is looking to move very, very quickly. Part of what they've sort of said are going to be their big marquee issues that affect clean energy is comprehensive tax reform, and I'll explain why on that in a minute. Tariffs is one of President Trump's favorite terms. And then a new theme of what they're calling energy dominance. And I'll dig into a little bit of more detail on that as well. So first and foremost, the president has to put in his people in the different federal agencies here. And the two key federal agencies that touch on clean energy would be the U.S. Department of Energy, and President Trump has nominated a gentleman by the name of Chris Wright, who is an executive from a natural gas fracking company, who also happens to sit on a geothermal company board and has also been involved with advanced nuclear. So he isn't just a natural gas advocate. He's very interested in some of these other technologies. He'll have to go through a Senate confirmation process over here to be confirmed as a new Secretary of the Department of Energy. So that position will have a lot of influence overall U.S. energy policy. And then he's also nominated North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum to lead the U.S. Department of Interior. And that is probably the one federal agency that probably has the most practical impact on U.S. energy policy because we have so much federal and public lands. That particular position, the Secretary of Interior, is the one that conducts like the leases for oil and gas development, for offshore wind, things like that. So we fully expect Governor Burgum to be very much at the forefront of U.S. energy policy. At the same time, presuming he gets confirmed by the Senate, which I think he will, President Trump has also named Governor Burgum, in addition to being the Secretary of the Interior, the new energy czar. And what does that mean? Well, he's going to have Secretary Burgum, once he's confirmed, added to the National Security Council so that energy issues can be considered as part of the overall strategy, U.S. National security strategy. And then similarly, he expects incoming Secretary Burgum to create a new National Energy Council and convene different leadership within the new Trump administration to focus on that energy abundance or energy dominance agenda. So let me just take those last three in the short amount of time that I have and then look forward to your questions. On tax reforms, the issue here is that you have a number of tax reforms cuts that benefit individuals that expire at the end of 2025. So Republicans are very anxious to find ways to extend those tax cuts for private individuals, for voters. And one of the areas they're going to be looking at are some of the clean energy tax credits that were passed during the President Biden administration, also known as the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. So there's going to be a lot of conversation about whether some of those tax credits are directly repealed or some of the eligibility criteria is modified. Some of the examples of how they might modify those tax credits is having very stringent, what they call foreign entity of concern criteria. So if projects have components that are produced from a country that is considered to be by the United States a foreign entity of concern, that project may not be eligible for tax credits. So we're going to be looking for efforts to fully repeal certain clean energy tax credits or to modify eligibility for those clean energy tax credits. And that's a conversation that will probably take up the vast majority of 2025. Tariffs, another big issue. It was a big issue. I became a subject matter expert on tariffs during Trump's first time around, during Trump 1.0. He likes to use those to try and balance what he perceives as unfavorable trade practices by competing countries. So think of what we call our Section 301 tariffs that specifically target countries like China. Those tariffs were enacted in 2016. They're still on the books today. He just recently announced prior to, well, our Thanksgiving holiday a couple of weeks back here, an intent to try and increase those tariffs a further 10%. He hasn't done anything because he's not president yet, but these are signals about what he wants to try and do. He also talked about increasing tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico by 25%. Those captured a lot of attention in the press as well. Now, these are just pronouncements from the president-elect. Doesn't mean he's going to follow through on these, but he does have the power in the United States to enact these types of tariffs on imported products in the United States. And in the past, those tariffs have had a direct impact on things like solar panels, wind tower nacelles, batteries for energy storage, things like that. So we're going to be keeping an eye on that. And the other thing I just mentioned real quickly is U.S. imports roughly about $3 trillion worth of goods as of 2023 numbers, and roughly about 426 billion of that are imports directly from China. So we're talking even a 10% tariff increase could mean hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's a very big issue, and we're going to be watching it very closely. And the last thing I mentioned, the energy dominance theme, where incoming Governor Burgum, who's going to be the new Secretary of Interior, would chair that. That is the creation of this National Energy Council. And the idea there is to try to seek permitting reform, eliminate regulatory red tape, try and free up the private sector to expand production of domestic energy supply. And that could be everything from fossil fuels to clean energy. So we're going to be very interested to see what's being proposed by this new National Energy Council and what that might mean for the clean energy space. So those are some of the things that we're going to be watching. For clean energy buyers, we're very interested in preserving some of the tax credits that directly benefit clean energy projects that we purchase power from, as well as seeing some permitting reform that might facilitate or at least accelerate new transmission investment in the United States. So those are a couple of areas that, and a couple very specific issues that we're going to be watching during the first few months of the incoming Trump administration. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm looking forward to your questions at the very end, but let me turn it back over to Marcus so that you can hear from our next panelist.
Great. So I think I'll just jump in. So thank you so much, Kyle, for the update on the US. We can now turn to Europe, where I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what's been happening over here. So if you could just go to my first slide. Wanted to just share a little bit the context of what's been happening in the European corporate renewable energy procurement market. So here you can see the corporate PPA market has really taken off in recent years. So just in terms of the gigawatts, we're seeing year on year this continued growth. And at 2024, we're looking at another record year. You might notice it's been quite solar driven. I think the simple reason for this is that it's easier to permit solar projects. You can build them faster. But of course, with wind PPAs, it generates a lot more electricity due to capacity factors. And we see actually an increasing interest in corporates procuring both because these profiles are very complementary. Over into what sectors are signing PPAs, we're still seeing a market dominated by big tech, but we see an increasing variety of industries signing PPAs. So I've listed here just the top industries, and this is the kind of thing that Brussels policymakers really want to see, because I'll explain in a bit later that the PPA has really captured the attention of policymakers, and the idea of how we can further open up this market has really taken off and carried ground. A bit of context to all of this is that Europe was, of course, very hit hard by the war in Ukraine. So this decision to stop importing Russian gas really sent electricity prices through the roof. So the attention around PPAs is also partly explained as their benefit of, hedging costs, reducing this exposure to volatility, and that's seen as a very attractive tool for industry in Europe. We're also seeing PPAs pop up more and more in legislation as a validation tool for sustainable products. So as we'll see with CBAM later, these kinds of treatment of PPAs in EU law will be more common, I think. Next slide. So we've had a big election year. The energy crisis and this impact on industry have been very strong themes. We've had this new European Parliament elected back in the summer. We've also had a changeover of political leadership of the European Commission. And we also had 11 national parliaments also having an election. So there's this big churn of leadership in Europe, which will then obviously dictate the policies in years to come. Next year, we're also going to have Germany and potentially now France having elections, and the formation of those governments will be quite influential at EU level because these are really, dominant EU member states. So what do these election results really mean? So over in the European Parliament, there had been a prediction of a kind of huge swing to the right. I don't think that quite happened, but what we've definitely seen is the EPP, the European People's Party, which is centre-right. They're kind of the kingmaker now in the European Parliament, so they can really choose who to form coalitions with to get legislation over the line. So they can either look to the left, so they've got the S&D, which is centre-left, Renew, Liberals and the Greens, or they can look to the right, so that would be the ECR party, or even further right, this new Patriots for Europe party, which probably the name tells you everything that you need to know about that party. So there could potentially be alliances there with kind of far right, which we've potentially not seen in the past. Over in the European Commission, so just as a quick reminder, every European member state gets one European commissioner, and the Commission has this exclusive right to propose new laws. So this new group of commissioners are very important and will really be drafting the new laws that we'll see in the coming years. I've just picked out a few that are kind of relevant for this topic. So at the back, we've got Commissioner Jurgensen for energy, Commissioner Hutzker for climate. In the front, we've got Commissioner Sejourné from France, responsible for industry. And then an interesting profile is on competitiveness. So we've got the Executive Vice President Ribera for industry and the energy transition. So she's given this kind of dual portfolio to really bolster EU industry and make sure that they don't suffer from too high energy prices. So she's got quite an important profile there. And then in the middle, we've got the European Commission President von der Leyen. Her big thing is competitiveness, but positively also there's going to be a strong continuation of the European Green Deal. if we go to the next slide, what will these people be doing? Well, the first key goal is really to bring down electricity prices in Europe. It's really been identified as how we can help industries be more competitive on a global scale. And there's also been some suggestions, particularly from Commissioner Sejourné, of a kind of EU first, how can we really start prioritizing European companies over potentially other parts of the world? So I think that's kind of an interesting global trend we're seeing. And how that will look like, the Commission is going to bring out this clean industrial deal. And key parts of that deal are going to be an action plan on affordable energy. There will be what is called an Industrial Decarbonisation Accelerator Act, and also a European Competitiveness Fund. So you can see these are kind of tips of kind of where we're going to go with this, and we'll be looking forward to seeing the details in the coming months and years. For PPAs, there's no kind of immediate policy actions. Much of the focus will be implementing legislation from the last political term. A big reform was the electricity market design reform, where again, PPAs were picked out as this tool for industry to help them hedge amid kind of volatility of the markets. And so member states now are obliged under this regulation to remove PPA barriers and really promote this as a tool. So I think the details of that we'll see in the next few years as this is implemented. And then at EU level, the Commission is also going to publish in 2026 a new guidance on PPAs to really help member states further promote this tool and implement this reform. So also looking forward to seeing what that looks like. We're also expecting PPAs to be popping up as the EU develops more carbon footprint rules. So as mentioned, they're really kind of being used as a badge of honor for marking products as sustainable that are sold in the EU market. And so this is actually a positive incentive to have in EU law if carbon footprint rules really recognize the benefits of PPAs. And then finally, just going over on the right, so the Commission President is continuing from her last term on the Green Deal. There was a significant amount of legislation adopted in the last few years, which are all geared towards how we can get Europe to this 2050 climate neutrality goal. So all of that has to be implemented, and a key part of that for renewables will be continuing to remove these bottlenecks of kind of the grids and flexibility challenge, where we have to really get the system ready for all these renewables to come online. And of course, also permitting still is a big challenge. You can see there with this carload of paper, there's still some way to go. So the EU will be really encouraging the member states to be unlocking these bottlenecks. So that was it for my EU roundup.
Thank you very much, Annie. Now let's go over to our experts, Modila, Piper, Andres, and Kenneth. All right, go ahead, please.
Thanks. So I'll kick this off just with a little bit of an introduction on the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. If we could see the slides, please. We have a relatively extensive slide deck, which you will get as part of the pack, but I will just pick out a couple of points that are key. We're now zooming right into one of the mechanisms that Europe has introduced, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. In very simple terms, it is a measure to address the potential concern of what's called carbon leakage, i.e. industries moving away from Europe for the fact that they are covered by the EU emissions trading scheme, which puts or which requires them to acquire allowances consistent with their annual greenhouse gas emissions, and then to surrender those. And as a consequence of that, there's been a concern that over the years, companies have moved away because of the higher compliance costs within the EU. In order to make that competitive and to reduce this form of leakage, they have introduced what's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is very often referred to as a border tax, but it actually works as a certificate scheme in the way that certain energy-intensive goods, they're listed here below: electricity, hydrogen, aluminium, iron and steel, cement and fertilizer. In the first round, if imported into the EU, will have to effectively, just like an EU producer, buy EU ETS comparable certificates. Those are called CBAM certificates, and surrender them in accordance with the emissions at their point of production. Go to the next slide, please. The framework is currently structured into two periods, one transitional period, which we're currently in. This is about basically getting used to the scheme, getting used to the reporting of emissions based on effectively your direct and indirect emissions at the point of production, and then reporting those and getting the mechanisms in place to have an entity in the EU that reports this on your behalf and then ultimately provides that to a registry, which is still in the process of being created. And I think there was also a quick reference to the fact that there's some implementing legislation being developed in relation to that CBAM regulation that deals with the definitive period in particular around the question of how the emissions need to be reported during or from 1st of January 2026 onwards, and whether there are some ways of excluding certain types of productions from the need to buy those CBAM certificates. So the CBAM certificates or the pricing of CBAM certificates will be pegged somewhat to the EU allowance price, but they will be less tradable. There's a need to have an amount at all times on account. So other than if you're used to allowance trading or more generally carbon credit trading, this will be much less liquid as a market, and it's just therefore effectively complying with the CBAM mechanism, making this WTO compliant by using certificates rather than a carbon border tax. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into too much of the definitive phase modalities. We can pick those up in the Q&A if there are specific questions, but suffice to say, and then I'll hand over to Kenneth for one of the exemptions, is that there are effectively in the process of you having to report, there are several hurdles that you need to overcome. One is obviously you need to have an authorized declarant, which does the reporting of the emissions on your behalf, and on the basis of which you then calculate the number of CBAM certificates that you need to have, and you need to hold on account for the total number of goods imported and the respective direct and indirect emissions, and also how that reporting works. There are two possibilities to get exempted. One is on the basis of exporting from a country or producing in a country that has a comparable emissions trading scheme. That's currently in discussion for the UK, who obviously shared an emissions trading scheme with the EU before Brexit, but not significantly with any other country at the moment. So that's not really an option that's considered by most of those covered by the CBAM exporting to Europe. And then there's the other point, which Ken will pick up now, which is the ability to reduce the number of CBAM certificates that you need to buy and then surrender by using a renewable corporate PPA. Kenneth.
Thanks so much. Can we go to the next slide, please? Maybe if we skip over, I think this slide as well. Next slide. I think there's a divider CBAM. There we go. Thank you. So thanks very much, Andreas. So as mentioned, there are sort of a limited number of exemptions. So basically, any importer of CBAM goods into the EU would need to buy a number of CBAM certificates. So next slide, please. CBAM certificates covering the embedded emissions in the production of those goods. Now, the CBAM certificates are themselves, the CBAM certificates would need to be procured by sort of the May of the year after the production. And one of the notable exemptions is through the power purchase agreement. If we go to the next slide. Now, a power purchase agreement, as defined under the CBAM regulation, is a contract under which a person agrees to purchase electricity directly from an electricity producer. Now, this is a fairly broad definition. At the moment, there's limited guidance. However, through the transition phase, we would expect that to be more detailed. There has been previously discussion whether different types of power purchase agreements would be accepted under this definition. However, there's a general consensus, which is that this is primarily physically settled. So in other words, you need a injection of electricity within the same grid as the buyer. Now, there's further definitions, especially when it comes to different CBAM goods, such as in the case of electricity. But I think for the purposes of this presentation, if we focus on goods such as iron and steel, aluminium, cement, and fertilizer, you'll be looking at that the producer of these goods has a contract with a producer in the same country. If we can move to the next slide. So just to understand the impact of a PPA, we've highlighted three different types of PPAs and how they would operate. And essentially, this is the mechanism which would be sort of recognized for the purpose of the CBAM exemption. Now, as a general type, you have a physical or sleeved PPA. This is more common in markets where you do have, for example, the right to, or in markets where you do in fact have a legal right to enter a contract with a generator. So you have contractual relationship between generator and buyer. And that, for example, any top-up electricity required by the buyer can be produced or can be sourced through the supplier. You would also have, for example, in a number of countries, environmental attribute certificates, which are generally used to basically transfer the right to claim renewable attributes associated with renewable generation. And that operates through the issuing body and registry system. So through a physically settled PPA, this is where you would have physical settlement or physical delivery of power. If we can move to the next slide. If you have, for example, cross-border trading in electricity, which is more common, for example, between EU member states, but I think would only have relevance between third countries outside the EU, where you do have interconnected grids. You do have a slightly more complex mechanism. However, as long as the electricity could notionally transfer between buyer and seller, this should be acceptable within the scheme. And thirdly, we have the virtual settled PPA, also the virtual financially settled PPA on the next slide. This is essentially a model where no power is actually traded between buyer and seller in this case. However, there's injection of electricity within normally the same grid. And you would instead have the physical delivery of power sort of arranged by a supplier to the buyer. And the electricity would be sold to the grid through via a trader or balancing responsible party through route to market agreement. Now, in looking at common PPA terms, if we move to the next slide. So if we essentially trying to narrow down onto what type of PPA would be acceptable in the case of CBAM, PPAs have essentially long documents governing the transfer of electricity between the buyer and seller, as we've mentioned. These are commonly 7 to 15 years in offtake and cover a variety of different aspects of the relationship. So you would have, for example, elements on construction commissioning, the delivery of power, or a CFD mechanism in the case of financial settlement. You would have the transfer of environmental attributes, default remedies in the case of non-transfer, and various operational provisions talking about operation maintenance, balancing, force majeure. You would also have elements which deal with, say, regulatory changes, which in the case of CBAM may be of increased relevance should the scope of the CBAM sort of regime change in terms of recognition of the PPA. However, if we move to the next slide, there are certain key minimum criteria which have been defined under e-law, which form the basis for what would be an acceptable PPA. And this is essentially derived from a comparable regime through the RFNBO Delegated Act, which governs the recognition of electricity or renewable source hydrogen produced within the European Union. So essentially, there is limited, as we've noted before, there's limited express requirements beyond the general broad term of power purchase agreement. However, the key concepts of a power purchase agreement for the purpose of CBAM would be that there's legal agreement in place, that on its own or in combination with other agreements, that the PPA results in renewable source electricity being nominated, scheduled, and delivered to the buyer. So in other words, it should be within the same grid, and that the buyer should be in a position to demonstrate that the same production amount has not been claimed by anyone else. This can, for example, and is in many cases done most effectively through the use of environmental attribute certificates. Demonstrate sufficient information to evidence that the production and consumption match within the temporal granularity. So, for example, the RFNBO Delegated Act with respect to hydrogen deals with a geographic and temporal boundaries. So, in other words, it has to be consumed within the same year and also within the same geographic region. And furthermore, there's additional consideration whether power is being delivered across one bidding zone or different zones in that case. If we move on to the next slide. So in a sense, we're looking for, there's a limited distinction how the PPA would need to look on how the CBAM looks in effect. And we're essentially looking on the analogy to the regime for the RFNBO Delegated Act. In a sense, once these criteria have been fulfilled in the respect of the power purchase agreement, that should be sufficient for the CBAM. I think it's a fairly high-level tour through the regulations when it comes to the power purchase agreements. However, happy to discuss any further questions.
Thank you, Kenneth and Andreas, for this overview. I know this is a very complex topic, so you have a big job just explaining this, so really appreciate it. With that, now let's look into the perspective of some of the companies that or industries that may or may not be impacted by CBAM. We invited Brett Smith to share his perspective from a U.S. steel perspective. Brett, please take it away.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Brett Smith. I'm Senior Director of Government Relations at the American Iron and Steel Institute, AISI, based in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. I'm going to provide some background here today on our sector in the United States. Some background information, but our perspective on a number of the issues at play here as well. Just briefly, AISI's history is deep and substantial. Today, we represent companies that have both integrated production and EAF, electric arc furnace production as well. We also represent at AISI associate members who are both suppliers and customers of our producer member companies. Next slide, please. On the carbon front, one of the top items that we'd like to discuss is the American steel production from a carbon intensity perspective leads the way in terms of low carbon steel production among the major steel producing nations. There's been a number of analyses that point that out. One in particular from a firm called Global Efficiency Intelligence, which is a global firm, pinpointed that in particular that among the 9 largest steel producing countries and the EU, the US has the lowest carbon intensity. And there's a number of reasons for that. Number one is the fact that we have the largest amount of EAF or electric arc furnace steel production in the world. About 70% of U.S. production comes from EAF production or from EAF facilities. But beyond that, we use a host of, at the integrated level, domestically produced iron ore pellets as well. We also have a large preponderance of use of natural gas and renewable electricity throughout the overall U.S. economy, but certainly through the American steel sector as well, both directly and through our electricity purchases, which continues to rise in terms of the amount of renewable electricity and natural gas-fired electricity that makes up our electric grid. And there's a number of new technologies as well, relatively new technologies that the U.S. is leading in from the steel perspective. The use of HBI and DRI, hot briquetted iron and direct reduced iron, which primarily use natural gas as a reductant, as opposed to coking coal, which is traditionally done. There's a substantial amount of DRI and HBI production within the U.S. industry, and much more to come. Hydrogen as well is a substantial opportunity for our industry to use hydrogen in the steelmaking process. The number of other breakthrough technologies, CCUS is something else that our member companies are working towards and integrating within their facilities. So a whole host of reasons why the U.S. Industry of iron and steel production pinpoints the lowest carbon intensity among the major steel producing nations. Moving forward, next slide, please. We have a whole one item I did want to point out, is to point out there was a study done by McKinsey and Company recently pointing out that steel is the only material that's critical to all low carbon technologies. renewable energy, electricity, carbon capture, all of those items listed there. Steel remains the material of choice and will remain the material of choice for all of those technologies. Our challenges, of course, as we move to the next slide, please, are the global ones. Number one being the global steel overcapacity of steel production, which remains significant. You can see there over the past 2 decades or so, the gap that continues to grow in terms of production and capacity. Data here shown from both the OECD and the World Steel Association, showing the capacity being quite substantial, and then the capacity production gap continuing to rise, even though we had a dip for a number of years recently. That continues to grow. And the reason that this is a problem, or one of the reasons is, or the threat from our standpoint, is we view it as a potential to undercut the progress that we've made from the American iron and steel industry perspective, as it relates to subsidized and dumped products, largely that have a higher carbon intensity, higher carbon content than what we make here. Next slide, please. You can see here that the Chinese steel industry, the production has exceeded a billion metric tons for 4 years in a row. From 2023 data, you can fully expect that to be the case in 2024 as well. You can see in this graph how that has substantially increased over the past 2 decades. Just from a scaling standpoint, the U.S. industry has a capacity of about 100 million tons for the U.S. sector. So comparing to 1 billion metric tons from the Chinese perspective is obviously quite concerning. And one last slide I want to point out from a data perspective is the projected, steel capacity increases just over the next 3 years. In particular, you obviously see in this chart how the Asian steel industry, yes, that's a lot of China, but not only China, continues to increase. India is a substantial portion of that as well. Also, the China Belt and Road Initiative, as it relates to Indonesia, as it relates to Vietnam and other areas of Southeast Asia, continues to see substantial steel capacity increases over the next couple of years. And again, we are anticipating and concerned that a lot of that additional capacity increases are going to be products that have higher carbon content than what we produce here in the United States, and produces and poses a serious threat to the progress that we have made, the investments that we're continuing to make at an American perspective from our industry standpoint moving forward. So one of the reasons, or one of the issues that we look towards in a way to combat that, is the concept of the border carbon fees or tariffs. Next slide, please. This will be my last slide on some of the substance, and then we can transition into the Q&A. You can see a lot of the data here pointing out for both flat products and longs within the steel sector, the U.S. average being substantially lower than the global average. You can see some of the outlying figures there. This is a particularly useful graph and display that shows how the U.S. industry and a lot of other in areas of the world, the steel industries, how they are leading and what the threats are from a number of other challenges. So we, from an American steel perspective, are supportive of measures that would institute border carbon fees on imported products into the U.S. that have a larger carbon content on a product level, in particular, pointing out specifically from our perspective that we do not believe that this necessitates a domestic carbon price be a policy measure. Perhaps we can get into that a bit in the Q&A. But beyond that, we feel that as U.S. policymakers continue to look at border carbon fee options, that they need to apply this to as many countries or most countries as they can to make sure that it's not riddled with loopholes that would allow dirtier, carbon heavier products to evade the carbon fees that may be put into place. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'll just ask to transition to my last slide, which has contact information I don't want to continue to go. Perhaps we can transition into some of that in the Q&A, but thank you for your attention. Glad to answer any questions as we move forward.
Thanks a lot, Brett, and thanks to the whole panel for your presentations. We're now moving to the Q&A part. I'm going to kick us off with a few questions for the panel, but everyone, please feel free to use the Q&A function of Zoom and submit your questions I may have. Let me kick us off first with a question for Annie. So Annie, you know, from a US perspective, we often think about, when we think about the EU, we do think about kind of the regulatory power that it has. Do you feel like how can regulations in the EU support accelerating corporate procurement of clean energy in Europe?
Thanks, Marcus, and also thanks everyone for the really interesting presentations. As I mentioned, there is a lot of political attention around the procurement market. Definitely politicians seeing the benefits of using renewables. But I guess the elephant in the room is that we don't really need more regulation on what is essentially a market tool. So I think there can be incentives in EU law like carbon footprint methodology. There could also be a place for looking into managing the kind of credits risk around signing PPAs, so potentially kind of state-backed guarantee schemes. Those things are being looked into in Europe. But I'm hoping that we move towards a place where we can just, support this market, but not kind of over-regulate a good thing, which sometimes is a bit the temptation in Europe. And of course, as alongside this, kind of continue to removing these renewables bottlenecks, we'll just make sure there's more projects available. And so all the kind of work on grids and permitting will continue to be really important there.
Thank you, Annie. I have a question for Kyle too. Kyle, Trump is always in the headlines. There's a lot of coverage. There's also some hype sometimes, both on like the change that may happen, the things that may not happen. From your perspective, Kyle, what do you think is some parts that you feel like this is overstated the case that how much impact this will have specifically for clean energy procurement markets?
It's a great question. It's hard to predict, but I would say just given what we learned during the first Trump administration, it may be very difficult to do an outright repeal of many of the clean energy tax credits, given the very narrow margin of control Republicans have, particularly in the House of Representatives. A good sign was last August we had 18 House Republicans. Unfortunately, 3 of them were not reelected, so that list is down to 15 right now, indicated that they would not support a complete repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act's tax credits. In response, House Speaker Johnson said, rather than approach the tax credits with the sledgehammer, they were going to approach it with a scalpel. So we took that as a good sign that you're probably going to see some more emphasis on modifying the eligibility criteria for some of those tax credits rather than a wholesale effort at repeal. So I think a lot of folks in our industry were initially very concerned because, at least on the campaign trail, incoming President Trump had made it quite clear that he wanted to get rid of most of those tax credits because they had been promulgated by the Biden administration and Democrats. But I think the reality is it's going to be a much more detailed conversation on exactly what it is that they do as far as changes. So that's probably the number one thing that I think was overwrought initially, and now we have to wait and see what specific proposals are put on the table.
Thanks, Carl. I have a question also for Kenneth and Andreas. So we talked about CBAM, the PPAs, the importance of PPAs. What is the role of environmental environmental attribute certificates in the CBAM PPAs?
Maybe if I start with this, and I also see that has been a sort of related question in the chat around what needs to be added on top of the current IREX standard to make this usable, and sort of questions around how does it work with a scalable EU-aligned PPA. So I think what, as sort of Kenneth has shown very well on his slides, is that there isn't a lot at the moment available, although we're sort of all wait for the implementing act around what a PPA really means. And the difficulty is that obviously, depending on which exporting country you go to, you have very different market structures, very different models, from single buyer models, from pool models, etc. And PPAs look very different in all of those markets. And on top of that, I think the Commission, although it probably didn't quite mean it in that way, originally suggested that EACs on their own don't really sort of are sufficient or don't really constitute a PPA. There needs to be something else. And the way this is best approached from our perspective is to do two things. And this is exactly what Kenneth has shown on the slides. It's first of all, understand what a PPA model is in the European context, because that is where you start from. And I think the slides that were shown around, physically settled, financially settled, cross-border, it is, even though there are variants across member states, a model that is relatively common. And then the second question is, well, if we look at, clarity around one of the CBAM products that we already have some clarity on, which is hydrogen, how does a PPA need to look like? And Kenneth was referring to the RFMBO Delegated Act and the guidance to that. And it is quite logical to suggest that, for any of the other CBAM covered products, the requirements for PPAs will not be better or simpler than those put on hydrogen, which is obviously a preferred import from that perspective. Yeah, so you kind of start with the lowest common denominator being on the back of the structuring requirements that they put out there for imported hydrogen. And so with that, you already start seeing a number of structural requirements based on that guidance that will then make effectively a minimum set of criteria for a CBAM covered PPA, which does require environmental attribute certificates to be used, because that's what the requirement for hydrogen, or rather the guidance for hydrogen requires. And then there's also a point around some of the constructual requirements in terms of direct contractual relationships, how you settle this financially, physically settled. And just to finish off on that, we are currently working with ITREC, so basically the entity that set up the IREC standard, to develop CBAM compliant PPAs based on those criteria, because we appreciate the market has got very, very little time until 2026 to put something in place. And what we're trying to put out there is a model that is, adjustable to all sorts of different exporting markets with different market requirements, but meeting those key criteria that we see developing on the European level. So we do think, in summary, there is a possibility. We do think there's a possibility to harmonize the criteria in a way that we can make this work.
All right. Kind of anything to add? Otherwise, I'll jump to the next question. All right. Question for Brett. So CBAM, as far as I know, is the first carbon tariff basically that we have so far, but it may not be the only one. I've heard from a couple of companies that they feel like this might be common in other countries as well. For you, from your perspective, first of all, do you and your members, do you support instituting a carbon border fee similar to CBAM in the United States? And what do you think is the outlook for something like that to happen under the Trump administration?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I would say yes, we do support the idea, the concept of carbon border fees, which would differentiate or would apply to products imported that have a larger carbon content than those produced in the United States. There are a number of key aspects, of course, to that. It's a bit different than the CBAM, such that it is largely because we do not support, nor do we see this coming about, have a domestic carbon emissions fee as a part of U.S. policy directly. So that's obviously a difference. There's a number of complicated questions at play here, certainly one being data and all of those in scope as well. And I know a lot of that work is going on within the U.S. policymaking construct. It is a challenge, to be sure, but I would say that within the United States policy perspective, there are a number of key players who are very interested in pushing the concept. one in particular, Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, who's very much a leader on energy and sustainability and carbon issues, has been working for a number of months on what he calls his Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which would establish carbon border fees on a number of imported products. We're working closely with him on that. There are a number of issues that would, of course, need to be worked out. The question, or at least one of the big, I suppose, uncertainties is how the new incoming Trump administration will be involved on questions like that. It's no surprise, and it's certainly not news that administration, first time around, second time around, will be engaged on a number of trade-related matters on as they relate to larger policy questions. How that gets into the world of carbon emissions, remains to be seen. But I certainly, we take a number of opportunities and see a number of opportunities in that moving forward as well. It's going to be a challenge because it's quite complex, as everyone on this call knows. But we see certainly some real opportunities to that and want to be part of that process too.
Thanks, Brett. All right, and I'm trying my hardest here to see if I can distill some of the questions we have. We have a couple of questions here on the CBAM and PPAs and how that's interact with each other. And I think some of that, Andres and Kenneth, you've answered some of that already. Let me just see if I can add to those. So one question, well, can we confirm that EU importers, they cannot be the ones to buy PPAs or RECs? It has to be the suppliers. Is that correct?
Just to ask that question, in the CBAM regulation, you do have the concept of authorized importers, authorized declarants, sorry. So essentially the obligation lies in the authorized declarants, in other words, the importing entity to buy the CBAM certificates, or rather, first of all, to demonstrate the amount of emissions involved in the production of this imported CBAM goods, and also to buy the CBAM certificates in respect of those. So the obligation would lie with them.
Thank you. And adding on that, I think, again, you may have covered this in part, just double checking. One question was why do plain EACs, why are they not considered as acceptable under CBAM?
It's a bit of it's an interesting topic. It's a little bit difficult because there's limited guidance from the Commission in this respect. I suppose there is a bit of underlying thought in the respect of, at the moment, you do have, as Andreas mentioned, or as we've mentioned rather, you do have the RFNBO Delegated Act, which does set out the use of a power purchase agreement to demonstrate the production of rather the production and the consumption of renewable source electricity, under which you've got the criteria where you could say that, for example, EACs could be used to demonstrate that. It's a difficult one, which we're not really able to answer because we haven't really seen the logic of the arguments. But one could, for example, argue that, or rather, one understanding could be that if you purchase, for example, renewable source certificates without supporting a specific asset, for example, through an underlying PPA, you may sort of essentially through the unbundled power purchase unbundled certificates, you may sort of break that chain essentially of that support. It's a little bit of an academic topic. However, the thing is that if we're looking at CBAM compliance, you're essentially looking at fulfilling the definition of what the PPA is. Essentially, that's the only way to seek the exemption, and therefore, on that basis, only a power purchase agreement would appear to be acceptable. However, that's something which may develop over time, sort of as the CBAM mechanism develops.
Gotcha. Thanks, Kenneth. There's more questions. I don't think we're going to have time for more. I just want to, first of all, I want to thank, big thanks both to the panelists and also to our audience here. This is actually one of the more complex topics I think that we've covered in a webinar. And, I see the numbers here. I appreciate people actually, there's clearly a strong interest in this. It's very nice to see this. Thanks a lot for your time. We will publish this recording of the webinar. You will see it on YouTube, and we'll have it for our members. We'll have it available on our internal portal. And again, we'll also be available on YouTube. And for resource members, also reach out to Annie as well. All of us will put it online. Again, thanks a lot for everyone attending. It's been a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.